The man who rode down from the high lonesome was more a part of the mountain than he was of the world of men. 10 years had carved him into a shape of wind-weathered rock and hard-packed snow. His beard was the color of winter twilight, and his eyes held the flat, distant look of a sky that had seen too much and forgotten how to reign. The horse he rode was as lean and enduring as he was, a gray beast that moved with the patient, ground-eating gait of a creature who knew that all journeys, no matter how long, eventually ended. He carried a rifle that was an extension of his arm and a silence that was a part of his soul. He had left this valley a boy, full of rage and a grief so sharp it had cut the lines of his future to ribbons. He returned a man, hollowed out and quiet, seeking nothing more than a place to let his bones rest, a place to face the ghosts he had outrun for a decade. He did not expect to see smoke curling from the chimney of the old cabin. The sight of it, a thin, gray finger pointing to the heavens, stopped him cold. It was a sign of life in a place he had consecrated to memory and death. For a moment, he thought it was a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by a heart too long starved of human warmth. But the smell of pine smoke was real, sharp and clean on the autumn air. He nudged the horse forward, his hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle, not out of aggression, but out of a deep and abiding caution that the wilderness had taught him was the price of survival. The cabin stood as he remembered it, a squat, sturdy thing built of lodgepole pine, its seams chinked with mud and time. But it was different. There were flowers, faded now by the coming frost, in a box beneath the window. The porch, which he remembered as a place of splintered, sagging boards, was swept clean. Then he saw her. She was by the woodpile, her back to him, her movements economical and strong, as she split a log with a practiced swing of a maul. The braid of dark hair that fell down her back was thicker, shot through with threads of silver he did not recognize, but the line of her shoulders, the set of her jaws she bent to her work, that was a memory so vivid it felt like a brand on his heart. He had been told she was gone, carried off by the same fever that had taken his parents, a piece of news delivered by a breathless cousin that had been the final stone in the avalanche that drove him into the mountains. He had grieved her with a ferocity that had burned out everything else inside him, leaving only the cold ash of existence. And yet, here she was. A boy came out of the cabin then, a small, serious figure with a shock of black hair and eyes the color of his own. He was perhaps 9 years old, with a lanky frame that promised height, and a way of moving that was all quiet purpose. The boy looked from the woman to the man on the horse, his expression not one of fear, but of solemn curiosity. He said nothing, simply stood there, a miniature sentinel guarding the entrance to a life the man had never known existed. The woman turned, sensing the boy's stillness, and her eyes met the man's across the clearing. The maul slipped from her hand and thudded softly into the dirt. Her face, which he remembered as soft and full of laughter, was now a map of hardship and resilience. Lines fanned from the corners of her eyes, and a stubborn tension held her mouth. But it was her. The breath left his body in a ragged rush, a decade of frozen grief thawing in a single painful instant. He swung a leg over his horse, his movements stiff, his knees cracking in protest. He felt ancient. He walked toward her, the ground unsteady beneath his feet. The world had tilted on its axis. 10 years of solitude, of talking to no one but his horse and the wind, had stolen his words. He stopped a few feet from her, the silence stretching between them, thick with the weight of all the years that had been stolen from them. He looked at her, then at the boy, who now stood half hidden behind her skirts, his dark eyes wide and searching. The math was simple. The truth was undeniable. "I heard you were dead," he said, his voice a rough, unused thing, like stones grinding together. The woman's expression hardened, a shield sliding into place over the shock. "The news travels slow up on the mountain," she answered, her voice low and steady. It was the same voice, but the melody was gone, replaced by a flat, unyielding tone. "And it seems it's not always true." He had no answer for that. The accusation in her words was as clear as the cold mountain air. He had run. He had believed a lie because, perhaps, it had been easier than facing the ruins of his life. He looked at the boy again, a question forming in his throat that he had no right to ask. The boy stared back, his gaze unwavering. He was a piece of the man's own soul, standing there in the dirt, a stranger. "He's mine," the man stated. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that settled into his bones with the weight of a granite slab. The woman pulled the boy closer, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "He is," she said, her voice daring him to dispute it. "And I raised him. Alone." The word hung in the air between them. Alone. It was a summary, a judgment, and a testament to a strength he could barely comprehend. He had chosen his solitude. Hers had been thrust upon her. He had survived the wilderness, but she had survived the world, a far more dangerous place. He felt a chasm open at his feet, a gulf of 10 years filled with struggle and silence that he could never hope to cross. He had come back seeking an ending, a quiet place to fade away. Instead, he had found a beginning he never knew he'd lost, and a responsibility that terrified him more than any grizzly or blizzard ever had. The silence in his own heart, a companion for so long, was suddenly deafening, mocking the life that had gone on, impossibly, without him. He did not ask to come inside. He would not have been surprised if she had told him to turn his horse around and ride back into the oblivion from which he had come. Instead, she gave a short, sharp nod toward the barn. "Your horse can take the empty stall. There's hay." It was not an invitation, but a statement of fact, a grudging acknowledgement of a practical need. He understood. He was a problem to be managed, a stray element that had wandered into her carefully constructed world. He led the horse to the barn, his movements slow and deliberate. The barn was his father's, but like the house, it was subtly changed. Her touch was everywhere. Tools were hung with a neatness his father had never possessed. The stalls were clean, the air thick with the sweet, dry smell of hay and the warm animal scent of a milk cow that watched him with placid brown eyes. He unsaddled his horse, his hands moving through the familiar motions automatically. His mind was a maelstrom. The boy's face was imprinted on the inside of his eyelids. His son. A son who looked at him with the guarded eyes of a stranger. He spent a long time in the barn, currying the horse, checking its hooves, performing the small, necessary tasks that kept his hands busy and his thoughts at bay. But the thoughts came anyway, relentless as a winter wind. He saw her face, aged by care and not by years. He heard her voice, stripped of its music. He felt the crushing weight of his own failure. He had mourned a ghost while a living, breathing woman had fought to survive, to raise his child in the shadow of his absence. The grief he had carried for her felt like a cheap imitation now, a selfish indulgence compared to the hard reality of her life. When he finally emerged, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. A lamp had been lit inside the cabin, casting a warm, yellow square of light onto the packed earth of the yard. The smell of stew hung in the air. He stood for a long time, a silhouette against the fading light, caught between the wilderness behind him and the fragile, impossible light ahead. He was a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. The cabin door opened. The woman stood framed in the doorway, her form softened by the lamplight. "Supper is on," she said, her voice flat. "The boy needs to eat." It was a reason, not a welcome. He was an obligation she had to fulfill for the boy's sake. He walked toward the light, each step an act of immense effort. Inside, the cabin was a single room, but she had made it a home. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its warmth a living thing that pushed back the evening chill. The room was scrupulously clean. A simple wooden table was set for 3. The boy was already seated, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the man as he entered. The man took off his hat, his hair matted with sweat and dust. He felt large and clumsy in the small space, a wild thing brought indoors. He sat at the place she had indicated, the one farthest from the fire. They ate in silence. It was a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. The stew was rabbit and root vegetables, savory and hot. It was the first real meal he'd had in months, but the food tasted like ash in his mouth. He watched her, the way she cut the boy's meat into smaller pieces, the way she ate with a weary grace. He watched the boy, who ate with a solemn intensity, occasionally flicking a glance at the strange man who shared his face. The man felt the questions burning inside him, 1,000 of them. What had she done? How had she survived? Who had helped her? But he knew he had no right to ask. His questions were 10 years too late. His presence here was an intrusion, a disruption of the rhythm she had established through sheer force of will. He was a debt come to call, and he had nothing with which to pay. After the meal, she sent the boy to the small loft that served as his bedroom. The boy went without a word, climbing the ladder with an agility that spoke of long practice. He paused at the top, his small face framed in the opening, his eyes lingering on the man for a long moment before he disappeared. Now they were truly alone. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. The woman began to clear the table, her movements efficient and sharp. "You can sleep in the barn," she said, not looking at him. "There are blankets in the tack room." "All right," he said. He had expected as much. He deserved as much. He stood, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He was halfway to the door when her voice stopped him. "Why?" she asked, her back still to him. The word was quiet, but it was laden with the weight of a decade. It wasn't, "Why are you here?" It was, "Why did you go?" He turned. He owed her the truth, no matter how pathetic it sounded. "My cousin. He rode out to the trapping camp. Said the fever took my folks. Said it took you too." He swallowed, the words thick and painful. I believed him. There was nothing left for me here, so I went where there was nothing at all. She was still for a long moment, her hands submerged in the basin of wash water. Then she slowly turned to face him. There were no tears in her eyes, only a profound, bottomless weariness. "Your cousin was a fool," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "And you were a bigger one for believing him. I was here. I was always here." She turned back to her washing, the set of her shoulders a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. He had given his reason, and she had found it wanting. He put on his hat and walked out into the cold, clear night, the cabin door closing softly behind him, shutting him out of the warmth and the light. The barn was dark and smelled of hay. He found the blankets, rough wool that smelled of horse and dust, and made a bed for himself in an empty stall. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of the animals, a stranger in his own home, a father to a son who did not know his name, and a ghost to the woman he had never stopped loving. The silence he had cultivated for 10 years had been a shield. Now it was just a cage. The days that followed fell into a brittle, unspoken routine. He rose before dawn, the habit of the mountains ingrained in him, and did the work that needed doing. He mended the sagging section of the corral fence his father had built, his hands finding a forgotten familiarity in the tools. He cleaned out the spring, reinforcing the stone lining and ensuring a clear, steady flow of water to the cabin. He chopped and stacked a mountain of firewood, enough to see them through the harshest winter. He worked with a silent, relentless energy, pouring all the confusion and guilt that churned inside him into the solid, tangible tasks of the homestead. He was proving himself. He knew it, and he knew she knew it. He wasn't proving he could work. The wilderness had already taught him that. He was proving he could stay. He was trying to build a bridge back across the 10 years of his absence, with sweat and split logs and repaired fences. It was the only language he had left. The woman watched him from the cabin, her expression unreadable. She went about her own tasks with the same focused determination. She tended her garden, harvested the last of the potatoes and squash, and began the work of preserving them for the winter. She milked the cow, churned butter, and baked bread that filled the small valley with its warm, wholesome scent. They moved in separate orbits around the same small center of gravity, their paths rarely crossing, their words few and purely functional. The axe needs sharpening. I left water by the porch. The boy was his shadow. He would appear at the edge of the man's working space, a silent observer, his dark eyes taking in every movement. He watched how the man knotted a rope, how he wielded an axe, how he soothed the horse with a low murmur and a gentle hand. The man never spoke directly to him at first, sensing that any direct approach would send the boy scattering like a deer. Instead, he simply acknowledged his presence with a small nod. He would sometimes leave a piece of wood he had carved, a rough bird or a lopsided wolf, on a stump where he knew the boy would find it. In the evenings, he would see the small figure in the boy's hands as he sat by the fire. One afternoon, as the man was reshoeing his horse, the boy spoke for the first time. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice small but clear. He pointed at the horse. The man paused, the horse's hoof held steady between his knees. "Ghost," he answered, his voice rough from disuse. "Because for a long time, it was just him and me, and we were like ghosts on the mountain." The boy considered this with a gravity that was far beyond his years. "My name is Samuel," he said, as if offering a piece of information in trade. "I know," the man said softly. He had heard the woman call him by name, but hearing it from the boy himself was different. It made him real. Samuel. It was his own father's name. The choice was a quiet accusation, a reminder of the lineage he had abandoned. From then on, the boy's orbit drew closer. He would hand the man tools. He would ask quiet, practical questions. "Why do you hold the hammer like that? Does it hurt the horse?" The man answered each question with simple, honest words. He was teaching the boy, he realized, all the things a father was supposed to teach a son. The knowledge was there, inside him, but the feeling of it was new and terrifying, and more wonderful than anything he had ever known. He was building something with the boy, a fragile structure made of shared tasks and quiet words, and he was terrified that a single wrong move would bring it all crashing down. The first snow of the season came early, a fine, dusting powder that turned the world silent and white. It was a warning. The true winter was coming, a time of isolation and hardship. It was also the day they had to go to town. "We're low on salt and flour," the woman announced at breakfast, her gaze fixed on her bowl. "The trading post will have its winter stock in." The man simply nodded. The thought of town, of other people, of their stares and questions settled like a cold stone in his gut. He had avoided them for a decade, but he could not avoid them now. He was tied to this woman and this boy, and their world included the town, whether he liked it or not. The journey was made in a small, sturdy wagon pulled by a mule. The man drove, the woman sat beside him, and Samuel sat in the back, tucked under a wool blanket. They were a portrait of a family, a lie painted over a fractured truth. The silence between the man and woman was different now. It was no longer just the absence of words, but a space filled with a tense awareness of the performance they were about to give. The town was little more than a single dusty street, lined with false-fronted buildings, but to the man, after 10 years in the wilderness, it felt like a roaring city. People stopped and stared as their wagon rolled past. Whispers followed them like a cloud of dust. He saw faces he recognized, now older, etched with the passage of the same 10 years that had hollowed him out. He saw surprise, then suspicion, then a cold, unwelcoming judgment in their eyes. He had been a ghost for too long. His return was an unwelcome resurrection. The social heart of the town, he quickly saw, was a formidable woman with hair the color of iron and a dress as black as a judge's robe. She stood on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile, surrounded by a small group of other women, and her eyes fixed on their wagon with a look of undisguised contempt. He remembered her as the wife of the town's wealthiest rancher, a woman who wielded gossip like a weapon. He helped the woman down from the wagon, his hand briefly touching hers. It was the first time they had touched in 10 years. Her hand was calloused and strong, but for a fleeting second it trembled in his. He saw the faint tremor of fear in the proud line of her jaw, and a protective instinct, fierce and primal, rose in him. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the matriarch and her chorus moved to intercept them. "Well, look what the mountain coughed up," the woman said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Her eyes raked over the man, taking in his worn buckskins, his wild beard, the deep-set weariness in his face. Then her gaze shifted to the woman beside him. "We all thought you were dead. It seems we were mistaken, though some might say it would have been more decent if you had been." The woman flinched as if struck. The other women tittered, their eyes sharp and cruel. The man stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of the woman and Samuel. He was not a large man, but the wilderness had stripped him of every ounce of softness, leaving only lean muscle and hard bone. There was an aura of quiet, dangerous capability about him that made the women take an involuntary step back. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words were quiet, flat, and as final as a rock slide. "Her name is Sarah," he said, his eyes locked on the matriarch. "She is my wife. The boy is my son, Samuel." He let the words hang in the air, a public declaration that could not be taken back. "If anyone in this town has an issue with my family, they can bring it to me, directly." The matriarch's face flushed with anger. She had expected a shamed, broken man, not this unyielding pillar of quiet defiance. She opened her mouth to retort, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It was a look she had never seen in the men of the town, who were loud and blustering. It was the look of a man who had faced down death in the lonely places of the world and was utterly unimpressed by her brand of petty tyranny. She snapped her mouth shut, gathered her dignity like a cloak, and swept past them without another word, her coterie trailing in her wake. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but a line had been drawn. The fragile peace of the valley had been broken. He had named them his family, had thrown down a gauntlet in the middle of the street. The silence in the wagon on the way back to the cabin was heavier than ever before, charged with the consequences of his words. He had claimed them. Now he had to prove he was worthy of the claim. That night, after the boy was asleep in the loft, the silence in the cabin became too loud to bear. The confrontation in town had changed something, cracking the careful shell of their arrangement. He had called her his wife, a word he had no right to use, a title he had forfeited a decade ago. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the small space. She sat by the fire, mending one of Samuel's shirts, her needle moving with a quick, almost violent rhythm. Finally, she set the shirt aside. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice low. He stopped his work, looking at her across the dimly lit room. "What was I supposed to do? Let her talk to you that way?" I've been dealing with her and others like her for 10 years, she shot back, a flicker of the fire he remembered in her eyes. I've managed. I've survived their whispers and their scorn. Your grand declaration in the street doesn't erase that. It only makes me a bigger target. You're not a target, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. You're my... He faltered, the word wife catching in his throat. It felt like a lie. You're Samuel's mother. He's my son. They needed to know. What they know, she said, rising to her feet and pacing before the hearth, is that the man who abandoned me and his unborn child has returned from the dead. They see a sinner come home, and they see me as the fool who took him in. You haven't protected us. You've put us on display. Her words were like blows, and he took them without flinching because he knew they were true. He had acted on pure instinct, a primal need to shield her. But he hadn't considered the repercussions in her world, a world governed by reputation and judgment. Then what do you want from me? He asked, the question torn from him. Do you want me to leave? The thought was a cold spike of fear in his chest. He had just found them. He couldn't lose them again. She stopped pacing and turned to face him, her expression a mixture of anger and a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. Leave, she whispered, the word laced with a bitter irony. You already did that. That's the one thing you've proven you're good at. No, I don't want you to leave. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I want to understand. I want the truth. Not the part about your fool cousin, the part about you. Why was it so easy for you to believe I was dead? Why didn't you come back to see for yourself? To even put a flower on a grave? The question hung between them, sharp as a shard of glass. It was the question that had haunted his own lonely nights, the one he had never dared to ask himself. He set the rifle aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. Because I was a coward, he said, the confession costing him everything. My father and mother were gone. The thought of you being gone too, it broke something inside me. It was a grief so big I couldn't face it. Running to the mountains felt like an answer. It was easier to be empty than to be in pain. It was easier to mourn a memory than it was to face a gravestone. It wasn't an excuse. It was just a failing. He looked up at her, his soul laid bare in his eyes. I loved you, he said simply, and losing you was the end of the world. I didn't have the strength to stand in the ashes. She sank back into her chair, the anger draining out of her, leaving only a vast, echoing weariness. She looked at this man, this stranger who wore the face of the boy she had loved, and for the first time she saw not the man who had abandoned her, but the broken boy who had run from a pain he couldn't bear. I wasn't dead, she said softly, her voice catching. But there were days I wished I was. After you left, and it became clear I was carrying your child. The looks, the whispers. My own family turned their backs. This land was all I had left. The banker in town, he held the note on it. He tried to take it from me 6 times. That woman, the matriarch, she tried to have me run out of the county as a moral disgrace. But I held on. She reached into a small wooden box on the mantelpiece and pulled out a small, intricately carved jade butterfly, its wing chipped. It was a token he had given her, long ago. I held on for him, she whispered, nodding toward the loft. He deserved a home. He deserved a life. So I fought for it, every single day. He saw it then, the 10 years, laid out before him not as an empty expanse of time, but as a daily battle she had fought and won. She had not just survived, she had triumphed, in a quiet, relentless way he could only admire. He had run from the ashes, but she had stayed and built a life from them. The gulf between them was not just time, it was character. "I am sorry," he said, the words inadequate but all he had. "For the pain I caused, for the cowardice, for not being the man you deserved." She didn't answer right away. She just held the broken butterfly in her palm, her gaze lost in the flickering flames of the fire. The silence that returned to the cabin was different. It was not empty or tense. It was a quiet space of shared sorrow, of truths finally spoken. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of understanding. And for the first time in 10 years, that felt like hope. The fragile understanding forged in the firelight was tested sooner than they could have imagined. Winter arrived in earnest, burying the valley in a deep blanket of snow and isolating the homestead completely. This was the man's world. He taught Samuel how to track rabbits in the snow, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. He kept the cabin warm and the path to the barn clear. Inside the small snowbound world, the three of them began to find a new rhythm. The silences became more comfortable, punctuated by the boys' questions and the quiet sounds of their shared existence. The man started to feel the hollowness inside him begin to fill, not with joy, but with a sense of purpose that was just as vital. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. As soon as the first thaw made the roads passable, a visitor arrived. He was not from the town. He was a man in a city suit and a derby hat, riding a fine horse that was ill-suited for the muddy track leading to the cabin. He radiated an air of smug, transactional authority. It was the banker. He dismounted without waiting for an invitation and strode onto the porch as if he owned it. The man, who had been splitting wood, set down his axe and moved to stand between the visitor and the cabin door, where Sarah had appeared, her face pale. "I am here about the outstanding debt on this property," the banker said, his eyes flicking from the man to Sarah with disdain. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. "The loan, as you know, is long past due. I have been lenient, but my patience has its limits. The railroad is planning a spur line through this valley. This property has become significantly more valuable." "We'll pay what we owe," Sarah said, her voice tight. The banker chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "With what? Your butter and egg money? I think not. The terms of the note are clear. Full payment is due, with interest. A sum I know for a fact you cannot produce. I am officially foreclosing. You have 3 days to vacate the premises." "3 days?" the man said, his voice a low growl. "That's not legal." "It is when the debtor has been in default for nearly a decade," the banker retorted, his confidence absolute. He held out the papers. "It's all here. Legal. Binding. The law is on my side. The sheriff will be here in 3 days' time to see you off the property. I suggest you pack." He gave them a thin, triumphant smile, turned on his heel, and rode away, leaving the foreclosure notice tacked to the cabin door like a death warrant. Sarah sagged against the doorframe, the fight seeming to go out of her. "He's done it," she whispered. "After all this time, he's finally won." The man pulled the notice from the door, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He felt a cold rage build inside him, a fury unlike anything he had felt in the mountains. This was not a force of nature like a blizzard or a bear. This was the calculated cruelty of a man preying on the vulnerable. This was an attack on his home, on his family. "No," he said, his voice hard as iron. "He hasn't won anything yet." For the next 2 days, the cabin became a war room. They worked by the light of the lamp long into the night. Sarah brought out a small battered ledger. "I kept records," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "Every time I made a payment, even a small one, every time he added a fee or a penalty, it's all here. The man looked at the ledger, at the neat columns of figures written in her steady hand. It was a document of her 10-year struggle. As he examined the numbers, a flicker of a memory surfaced. His father had not trusted banks. "He never took a loan," the man murmured, more to himself than to her. "He paid for this land in full, with gold, from a strike up in the mountains. The deed should be in his name, free and clear." "It was," Sarah confirmed. "But after your parents passed, the banker said there were property taxes, legal fees. I was alone. I didn't know any better. He drew up a new note, using the land as collateral. He said it was the only way." The man's hands clenched into fists. The banker hadn't given her a loan. He had manufactured a debt. He had trapped her. He looked at the foreclosure notice again, then at the original deed Sarah had kept, which was also in the ledger. Something about the survey lines, the legal description of the property, felt wrong. It was a long shot, a half-forgotten conversation with his father about an old boundary dispute, but it was all he had. "I need to send a message," he said. "There was a man I knew, from before. He works for the Territorial Land Office now. I saved his life once on the mountain. He owes me." He rode Ghost into the night, pushing the horse harder than he ever had before. He reached the telegraph office in the next town over just before it closed, a grimy outpost at the end of the railway line. He scribbled out a coded message, referencing the old survey marker, the name of the original surveyor, and the banker's name, and asked for an urgent reply regarding the legal status of the land grant. He paid the clerk with one of the few gold coins he had left. The clerk promised a reply would be sent to the sheriff's office in their town as soon as it came. It was a desperate gamble. The message had to travel hundreds of miles, be processed, and the reply had to come back before the sheriff arrived to evict them. He rode back through the darkness, the fate of his family now traveling along a thin metal wire. He had done all he could. Now, all they could do was wait. The third day dawned gray and unforgiving. The air was heavy with dread. Samuel stayed close to his mother, his small face a mask of worry. The man stood on the porch, his rifle cleaned and loaded, though he knew it was a fight he couldn't win with a gun. This battle would be won or lost with a piece of paper. Just after midday, they arrived. The banker, looking smug and victorious. The town matriarch, there to witness the final humiliation of the woman who had defied her. And the sheriff, a weary, reluctant man who was sworn to uphold the law, even when he didn't like it. "Time's up," the banker announced, swinging down from his horse. "I trust you've had the good sense to pack." "This is our home," the man said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't move from his position in front of the door. "You're not setting foot on it." "Sheriff," the banker said with a sigh of feigned exasperation, "this man is trespassing. The property belongs to me. Here is the court order. Remove him." The sheriff dismounted, his face grim. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at the man, then at Sarah and the boy. "The law is the law. I have to ask you to step aside." The man stood his ground. The clearing was silent, the tension drawn as tight as a bowstring. It was over. He had failed. He had come back only to watch them lose everything. And then they heard it, the frantic, rhythmic pounding of a horse's hooves coming fast up the track. A moment later, a rider from the telegraph office burst into the clearing, his horse lathered in sweat. He leaped from the saddle before the horse had even stopped and ran toward the sheriff, waving a piece of yellow paper. "A telegram," he gasped, out of breath. "For you, Sheriff, marked urgent from the territorial capital." The sheriff took the paper and unfolded it, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. The banker's smug expression began to waver. The sheriff read it once, then a second time, a slow look of dawning comprehension on his face. He looked up, his eyes moving from the telegram to the banker, his expression hardening. "Well now," the sheriff said, his voice carrying a new weight of authority. "This is interesting. It seems the land grant this cabin sits on was filed under the old Homestead Act of '62. The original survey, filed by a man named Abernathy, is ironclad. This telegram from the land office confirms it. He looked directly at the banker. It also seems that the revised deed you filed 10 years ago, the one your entire claim is based on, is fraudulent. It references survey markers that don't exist and overlaps with a federal mineral claim. That makes your document null and void. The color drained from the banker's face. That's impossible. It's a mistake. Oh, it gets better, the sheriff continued, a grim satisfaction in his voice. The territorial office also notes that a man of your name and description is wanted for questioning in 3 other counties for similar land fraud schemes. He folded the telegram neatly and put it in his pocket. It seems your business here is concluded, but mine is just beginning. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest. The banker sputtered, his arrogance collapsing into panic denial. The matriarch stared, her face a mask of disbelief and public humiliation. As the sheriff led the banker away, a defeated and broken man, he paused by the man on the porch. He looked at the quiet, resolute family standing together, and then at the foreclosure notice still tacked to the door. He reached out, tore it down, and crumpled it in his fist. "Looks like you had it handled after all," the sheriff said, and for the first time, there was a hint of genuine respect in his eyes. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving behind a stunned silence and the sweet, clean air of a victory that had been 10 years in the making. The spring that followed the long, hard winter was a time of rebirth, not just for the land, but for the family that lived on it. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new life, and the silence in the valley was replaced by the sound of a hammer on wood. The man was building a new room onto the cabin, a real bedroom for Samuel, and another for him and Sarah. The work was slow and hard, but his hands were sure and his heart was light for the first time in a decade. The town's attitude had shifted completely. The banker's arrest had exposed a web of corruption that had touched many families, and the man who had returned from the mountain was no longer seen as a ghost or a disgrace, but as a quiet hero who had brought justice to the valley. The matriarch kept to her own home, her power broken, her whispers silenced. When Sarah went to town now, people nodded to her with respect. She was no longer the abandoned woman. She was the survivor, the woman who had held on, the matriarch of a family that had refused to be broken. Samuel was no longer a solemn, watchful shadow. He was a boy, full of life and laughter. He worked alongside his father, learning the ways of the world, his hands growing calloused, his shoulders broadening. He had a father, a real and present father who taught him, protected him, and loved him. The hole in his young life had been filled. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft pastels, the 3 of them sat on the newly finished porch. The addition to the cabin stood behind them, solid and promising. Sarah sat in a rocking chair, her hands, for once, still in her lap. Samuel was on the steps, carving a piece of wood with a knife his father had given him. The man leaned against a post, watching them, a feeling of peace settling over him that was so profound it was almost painful. He had come back to this place seeking an end to his own story. He had come looking for a grave. Instead, he had found a life. He had found a resilience in Sarah that humbled him, and a son who was the best part of him. The emptiness he had carried for so long was gone, replaced by the warm, steady weight of love and belonging. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. The weariness was gone from her face, replaced by a soft, quiet strength. There was no need for words. The 10 years of pain and silence had not been erased, but they no longer defined them. They were scars, reminders of the battles they had fought, both apart and together. They had forged a new story, a story of redemption, of resilience, of a family found again. "It's a good home," she said softly, her gaze sweeping over the valley, the cabin, the boy. The man looked at her, at the silver in her hair catching the last light of day, at the small, chipped jade butterfly she now wore on a cord around her neck. He looked at his son, whose face was a mirror of his own, full of the promise he thought he had lost forever. He had spent 10 years believing a home was a place you left behind. He knew now that a home was not the land you owned or the roof over your head. It was the people you fought for, the family you built, the love you refused to let die. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is." And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally, truly, home.